Kindly, luminous beings, guardians of this Zoom space, we're here in love and peace and ask you for your hospitality, blessings, and protections, including protections for all communications and associated technology. And so let it be.
Thank you, Ali. Thank you ever so much, Ali. Much appreciated. And welcome everybody this evening. And apologies for my unsteady internet. For some reason, it's really choppy. And so Melanie's very kindly co-hosting and recording as well. So thank you, Melanie. And joining us this evening is a very special Chris. And Chris is one of the founder members of this wonderful group, which welcomes people who are interested in earth energies and all associated aspects of that. And dowsing forms a very strong center to that. So, Chris, you're very kindly going to share your knowledge and experiences with us about how to go about earth energy dowsing. So, is there anything else you want to add before you start presenting?
No, it's very nice to see the other two co-founders of the Earth Energy Group with me, Maeve and Paul, otherwise known as the Cow Whisperer. And I've never known why he uses the name Cow Whisperer. So perhaps at some stage he might tell us.
Thank you. And could we also ask before Chris starts this talk for everyone to just make sure they're on mute so we don't pick up other people's background noises. And again, like Melanie was saying, just raise your hand, or sorry, Chris, you were saying as well, raise your hand or, notify us in some way. And Melanie and I will do our best to help your questions get directed to Chris. Thank you very much. I'm going on mute. Over to you, Chris.
Right. Thank you. I'll get some screen sharing done if I can find it again. Right. Are we okay with that? Everybody see it? Great. Right. I'm probably trying to do too many things with a single talk. I wanted it to be, to some extent, a bit of background for people who don't have a lot of experience with earth energy dowsing. And I also wanted to try and put before you some questions which nobody really seems keen on answering about earth energy dowsing. So hopefully we'll get some of it about right for most people most of the time. So dowsing for earth energy lines. What I've got planned for this evening is to start with a bit of history, how we got to where we are now and some of the people that have helped us to get there. Then we'll go on to look at what we can find when we're dowsing around energy lines, the properties of the lines, what they mean, what we can do with them. Then we'll get on to the questions. What are energy lines? And finally, what is their purpose? So let's kick off with a bit of history. Water and minerals have been doused for a very long time. There's documentary evidence going back probably 500 or 600 years. And if we look at tombs in places like ancient Egypt, there seems to be pictures of people doing something that looks very much like dowsing. So people have been dowsing for a very long time, particularly for things that were difficult to find, like water and minerals, things that they depended on. And it stayed like that for a long time. Getting to the 19th century, we get records of people, particularly in France, dowsing for missing people and lost objects. In many European countries, dowsing or divining was not an acceptable occupation for anybody associated with the church. But in France, the priests seemed to be able to douse for, at least for water and minerals. But say in the 19th century, there were people starting to douse for missing people and lost objects. And then as we come into the 20th century, Alfred Bovey popularised dowsing for life force. And he came up with his now quite well-known Bovey's scale for measuring what he was looking for. None of the documentary evidence seems to mention Earth energies, but I feel people must have been dowsing for lines and feelings about what was going on in the Earth. And we know from Chinese history, Feng Shui has a very long history. And the energies flowing through the landscape were certainly recognised as being very important to how and where we live. And Feng Shui is now popular worldwide. The geomancers who had expertise in where to site places of worship, sacred places, don't seem to have written anything down. And I suspect that most of their knowledge was passed on verbally. And it's not until the 20th century that we get something that looks a bit like Earth energy lines, and that's lays. Lays were and are simply alignments of ancient places, churches, old churches, castles, prehistoric sites, megalithic sites. And it was found that visually these places could be seen to be lined up through the landscape. And it was in the 1920s that Alfred Watkins was able to find these lines in the Herefordshire countryside around where he lived. I don't think he had any expertise in dowsing, but he discovered these alignments. His first publication was a sort of pamphlet called Early British Trackways. And then he, probably 5 or 6 years later, published the book, The Old Straight Track, which, as far as I know, is still in print. Alfred Watkins defined what was an acceptable alignment for a lay. He had a list of acceptable places that would be expected to be on a lay, and he felt that they needed to have a certain number of these sites on a straight line, before it could count as a lay. You can draw lines through sites just by chance, and you'll get several on one line, but to get 5 locations on one line is getting to be a bit more than chance. Anyway, Alfred Watkins found that many people were interested in finding and following lays, and as time went on, there must have been some dowsers amongst these lay hunters, and by the 1950s, dowsers were realising that some of these alignments could be dowsed. Not all of them, but certainly some of them were dowsable. Around about the same time, Guy Underwood was dowsing for what he called geodetic lines. These were lines that he could find using his dowsing expertise in the landscape. He managed to get some of his findings published in the BSD journal, but he struggled and he was severely criticised by the top brass in the BSD, who thought that his findings were far-fetched, if not fantastic. But it didn't stop him. And during his lifetime, he wrote a book called The Pattern of the Past. Sadly, he was so fearful of telling too many people about what he was finding that it didn't get published until after his death. Didn't get published until 1969. And these are the sorts of lines that he was finding. He categorised the 3 types of line: water lines, track lines, and aquastats. And they were all multi-line features in the landscape, and it required very careful dowsing, and he used an incredibly sensitive dowsing tool to find these tiny lines. The lines themselves comprise the whole of a water line, track line, or aquastat, are very, very narrow. So he needed something very sensitive, and he was an excellent dowser. He saw underground water as a determining factor for the sighting of sacred sites, and he found patterns of flow of underground water around these sites. His geodetic lines were often serpentine, and he certainly didn't see them as energy lines. He didn't say anything about energy lines in the main text of his book, but they do get a mention in a footnote, which indicates that he was aware of them, but he didn't see geodetic lines as being energy lines or ley lines. The geodetic lines tended to be shorter, smaller features than lays. They're basically on the scale of sacred sites and buildings, rather than going right across the landscape. So moving on from the 1950s into the 60s, we have Wing Commander Clive Beadon. He had an illustrious career in the Air Force during World War II and afterwards, and he found out about dowsing and rose to the heights of BSD trustee and vice chairman. He was very well regarded and rated as an excellent dowser. He was one of the first people to distinguish between Watkins lays and energy lines, and he called energy lines power lines. He also discovered something called the Earth-star grid, which was associated with his power lines. And he was also a healer, and he developed a device called the spiral of tranquility, which is a combination of copper spirals and various crystals embedded in a resin, a clear resin, as a block. And these were used for calming energies and making places better for living and working. His work was continued and extended by Michael Poinder. Sadly, Michael Poinder is little known by most dowsers these days, but back in the 1970s through to the 90s, he was well regarded as a dowser, and he continued the work on the Earth-star grid, particularly in Ireland where he lived, and also developing and marketing the spiral of tranquility. Clive Beadon was very influential and had a beneficial effect on the dowsing of both Colin Bloy and Hamish Miller. Colin doused straight lines in the landscape and explored where they went and the sites that they linked together. And he realised that these straight lines that he was finding weren't all the same. They had an internal structure that he called bars, and in general, the wider, larger lines had more bars than the small ones. The number of bars could range from 3, I think there were often odd numbers, 3, 5 for the smaller ones, but you could get up into the 60s with some of the wider lines. So he was able to use a property of the lines to distinguish between them. Hamish Miller was also generally dowsing straight lines, although he was aware of spirals in some locations. And he found that lines also had this internal structure, which he referred to as bands. And he found that he could get a direction of flow from each of the internal bands on the line. And in general, the directions of flows alternated as you went across the line. He did find that, to his puzzlement, that the flow directions reversed at certain times. But we'll come back to that later. So most dowsers knew about lines in the landscape, but they were generally straight ones. But that all changed when Hamish Miller and Paul Broadhurst started investigating the Michael line. They thought it was going to be a fairly quick job to douse the full length of the Michael line from Cornwall across to East Anglia. But they soon realised it wasn't, and that whereas they thought it was just going to be a single straight line, it was a central straight line with an associated pair of serpentine lines. And those are the lines that we now know as the Michael and Mary. And that became the norm for Earth energy lines in the landscape. A central straight alignment and an associated pair of serpentine lines. So we're going to have a look at the properties of these lines. Width, height, direction, internal structures in the form of bands, directions of flow, male and female character. That always seems a bit odd to me for something as abstract as a energy line, but we'll look at that. Beneficial and detrimental effects. The movement of lines from side to side. Lines can move. They don't. If you find a line in one particular location, it may not be exactly where you found it next time you go back, unless it happens to be at what we call a node. You can dowse for frequency, colour, the age of a line. You can feel or find how strong it is. And it seems as if lines show consciousness in that they interact with us. To gauge the width of a line, you've really got to walk across it at right angles to the direction of the line. So if you walk away from the line and then turn back using a dowsing rod or a pendulum, asking to be shown the outside edge of a line, at some stage you'll get an indication. And then as you continue walking across the line, somewhere on the other side of the centre, you'll get another indication telling you that you hit the second outside edge. The widths of lines can vary from a few centimetres to 50 metres or more. Whenever you get a couple of dowsers or more dowsing the same energy line, you invariably find that the width each dowser gets is different. And I think rather than being a problem, that's something that tells us something. One of the people who's done most for Earth energy line dowsing is Rory Duff. And fairly early on, he categorised lines according to how many paces it was from one outside edge to the other. And he put them into groups of 5, 10, 20 or 30 pace lines in a little book he wrote in 2011 called Dowsing Observations. And at that time in the UK, there weren't, he didn't find any lines wider than about 30 paces. And he made a particular study of these wider lines across the whole country. I don't know whether you can see the cursor on the picture, but that line across there is the Michael Mary line. The Belinus line doesn't feature on this. That will be going from the Isle of Wight up to the north of Scotland. The Belinus line is a much narrower line, so he doesn't include that. And back in my early days of dowsing, I got involved with Rory, having a look at the detail of the lines across Lancashire and North Yorkshire, checking up on whether all the lines that he expected to be going through nodes were actually there and in place, which was quite an interesting experience for me, and a little bit of help for Rory in his work. More recently, Rory's written another small book, but packed with interesting information: Ley Lines, Earth Energies and Nodes. And in that book, he categorises lines and nodes in much more detail. Rory is also the person who discovered and named Emperor Dragon lines. Back in 2012, he found some very wide lines going through southeastern Spain, and he's written quite a lot about these lines. I think there are just 6 pairs of these lines that go completely around the Earth. And at the time when he discovered them, there was something like 80 or more paces from edge to edge. But along with most energy lines, they've grown in width since those days. Rory surveyed lines of all types in the UK, and he found that there are vastly more narrow lines than the wider ones. I've already mentioned that Michael and Mary fitted into his 30 pace wide category. But a few years later, John Harvey threw a spanner in the works with an article in Dowsing Today, in which he described finding that lines are very narrow when they're undisturbed, only 15 inches wide, he said. And he could douse these lines in an undisturbed state if that's what he asked to be shown. I've not been able to. He thought that all lines had this same very narrow width. I've not been able to confirm that, but I certainly it's possible to dowse for lines and get a much narrower line when you ask for them to be undisturbed. Because if you don't ask for that, the lines will interact with you and grow wider. And this really indicates that what we're dowsing isn't entirely objective. What we're dowsing is an interaction between us and the energy feature. Let's move on to height. Rory Duff did some experiments in the multi-storey office block in which he worked as a geologist, and found that he could douse lines that he found on the ground floor on all the higher floors as well. They were just as easy to douse at height. The American dowser Bob Dowser also saw lines as being vertical sheets, that they weren't just a line on the ground, they were actually a vertical plane sheet going up into the air and down into the earth. And the bands of each line were also vertical sheets. I had a try at dowsing for the small lines that pass through my house, and I was quite easily confirmed that up to a height of 10 meters, the lines were much the same as they were on the ground. Possibly slightly narrower, but easily doused above ground. Now that doesn't really fit in with one of my mentors from Riding Dowsers, Bill Holding. He always described and experienced and described lines as being tube-like. You could douse how high the tube was, how big it was, but it didn't extend infinitely into the skies. It seems with Rory Duff and Bob Dowser. Any line must have some sort of direction and an alignment, something you could measure with a magnetic compass. And you can find that direction by getting onto the centre of the line and asking your rod or pendulum to show you its direction or alignment. And if you want to see where the line goes to, you can ask your rod to guide you along its centre line. And as you walk, if you've got an app on your phone that makes use of a sat nav, you could actually plot the route and look at it on a map. Already mentioned that most long distance lines are in pairs that meander about an overall straight line or alignment. So the serpentine lines can vary considerably in their direction from the alignment. The alignments themselves can be doused, or certainly in some of the cases that I've looked at. The spine of Albion runs through the area of Lancashire where I live, and I've managed to douse that line, and it's much wider than the Ellen and Belinus. It has more bands and doesn't have any flow. Gary Biltcliffe and Caroline Hoare tell you quite a bit of information about how they doused and what they actually found with the Ellen and Belinus lines. The lines both have 6 bands on either side of the centre line, and they found that the bands within the line have an alternating positive and negative current. They also describe what happens when Ellen and Belinus cross at a node, and that's how they picture it. As the lines cross each other, they seem to focus down almost to a point and possibly disappear into the ground. And this narrowing of the line is something that you can use if you're following a line to see where any nodes occur. If you ask your rod to show you the outside edge of the line and you walk along it, as you approach another line where which forms a node with the one you're on, you'll get a turn as you move in towards the node. And then as you pass that node position, your rod will lead you out again to the full width of the line. So it's quite a useful technique. I think that this book, Beyond the Far Horizon, is probably the book that I've learnt most from by a very long way. out of any of the books that I've read on earth energy dowsing. It's based on the life and work of Billy Gawn, a great dowser from Northern Ireland, and we've got Nigel Twin to thank for compiling and telling Billy's story in the form of a very interesting, detailed, challenging and inspiring book. And you could spend months trying to repeat the experiments that Billy did in his farmyard, and the thing how he learned to create stone circles. There's a fascinating amount of information on there. Amongst the things that Billy found was a line structure. He had his own names for the different bands. He saw them, they felt different to him, and they seemed to be symmetrical about a central line. Not all the lines have these different types of lines in the same order, which helped him to distinguish between the lines. And the lines weren't really what you would call lines. Each line he found to be made up of overlapping C-shaped segments, a bit like links on a chain, but not a completely oval or circular link, but one that could break open, like and cause fractures on a line. I've mentioned Bob Dazer before. His little book, Planetary Patterns, documents the whole range of different sorts of energy that he's found across America. And that's a picture of how he visualizes the lines as parallel planes, vertical planes, with a separate plane for each band of the line. And from the spacing that he describes, the lines that he was working with are very much wider, bigger than anything we find in the UK. I suppose that's America for you these days. My personal experience, I've found that the wider lines in the UK, such as Michael and Mary, this is going back probably 10, 15 years, dowsing around Glastonbury and Barrow Monk, those lines seem to have 15 bands on either side of a centre line. That was my finding. I've not heard anybody describe their findings on it. But not all lines are as wide or as complicated as that. If you douse in between the stones on a stone circle, you'll usually find that there's a line marking the perimeter of the circle. And I've found that they generally just have one central line and one line on each side of the centre, with a overall width of not much more than the width of the stones themselves. And I've also found that if you create a line by intent, whenever I've tried it, and on lines that other people have created by intent, they always seem to come out as the same as the lines between the stones and the stone circle, of a centre line and two outer lines, one on either side of the centre line, so that it's a simple line. I have tried to create a more complicated line, but I haven't had any success in doing that. They always turn out to be simple, the simplest you could probably get. Not all that, not you don't have to use a dowsing rod or a pendulum to find what lines are like. As we know in this group from David Charman, lines can be seen, and most of the people that David teaches to see energies eventually manage to see something of energy lines, usually in the form of a tube or concentric tubes. This seems to be quite contrary to, say, the Bob Dowser idea of vertical planes, but it fits in with what Bill Holding finds, and also with Maeve's energy line structures. Rather than concentric rings, Maeve senses more of a spiral, no, double spirals, yin and yang spirals, and these are generally centered on a core of the line which is about a meter above the ground, and spiral out from that, so that if we're walking across a line, we walk through the spirals, and that's what we find as the bands of the line. Flow. I suppose because we're talking about lines as being energy lines, we tend to expect that there will be some sort of energy flow which can be doused. Usually dowsing does give you an indication of an overall flow of the line, and you can usually get an indication of a direction of flow in the bands of the line. You can do this by standing on the line and questioning, or by asking your rod to point. As we've mentioned before, the bands have been found to flow in either direction, but usually to alternate. And as Bob Dowser found, and Maeve has found, many others have found, the flow in the lines, in the bands of the lines, changes with the time of day, time of the month, and get strange effects at equinoxes and solstices. Lines are well known for having beneficial and detrimental effects on living entities that spend time close to them. Some detrimental lines are so powerful that they can make people feel ill within minutes, seconds in some cases. You can get a measure of how beneficial or detrimental by asking questions and dowsing on a scale of +10 through 0 to -10. +10 most beneficial that can be, and -10 the most detrimental. In the UK, the presence of detrimental energies only seems to be known by dowsers or geomancers. certainly not a part of the understanding that the medical profession have of possible causes of illnesses. And there's no governmental acknowledgement of possible problems from Earth energies. This is quite different to places like Austria and Germany, where a lot more work has been done, a lot more research has been done, bringing together the knowledge of dowsers and medical people, and the dangers of detrimental energy lines to health are sufficiently well known that even to get planning permission for a public building, you have to have a dowsing survey done, and if it finds anything severely detrimental, then you have to get somebody to rectify the situation. There's certainly plenty of people these days who are aware of and work with the energies that cause problems in our homes where we spend time. Adrian Incledon-Webber's probably the best known, but he's certainly not the only person who works on healing homes. And I think his first Heal Your Home book was probably about 12 years ago. The latest one of 2 or 3 years ago is much more detailed, covers a lot more ground, and certainly recommended. Male or female character, it's something that's puzzled me a bit, but I've met dowsers who feel different affinities towards lines and would describe them as being male or female. You can douse by asking questions, yes, no questions, but often these asking whether a line is male or female doesn't give you a clear answer. And one of the reasons for that is because many lines have a balance of male and female character. So you would need to douse for what proportion of the character is male, what proportion is female. Lateral movement. This brings us back to Rory Duff. He's done a massive amount of work on the side-to-side snake-like movement of energy lines. And he found that many of the lines that he looked at had similar periods of movement. Some of the 30 pace lines that he studied had a 24-hour period. And that means that if you find a line in a particular location and continue to monitor where that line is, checking it every hour, say, you would find it to move in a particular direction, slow down and stop, move back, past the place where you first started, out the other way, and then move back to your starting point. And it would do that over a 12-hour period. Not all lines worked with this period. Some were 12 hours, some were 18, some 48 hours. I even found one line that would move from one side to another, and when it got to its limit of its movement there, rather than moving slowly back, jumped suddenly to its other extent on the other way. There weren't many of those, but he certainly found at least one. And this movement from side to side can be quite considerable, several meters. It seems strange that people hadn't noticed this side-to-side movement until Rory discovered it. He first wrote about it in his Dowsing observations book and a couple of articles in Dowsing Today. And I think probably the reason that people hadn't found this movement before is that a lot of the time when we're dowsing, we're doing our work at sacred sites, megalithic sites and churches, which have nodes, and the lines seem to be tied to the nodes. So close to the nodes, there's very little of this side-to-side movement. You have to go well away from the nodes to pick up the side-to-side movement. That's a sort of graph that Rory got by his meticulous work, plotting the position of a line every hour. That's one of the lines that cross through Lancashire at a village called Billsborough, between Preston and Lancaster. Very clear side-to-side movement. And Rory describes this lateral movement as the line's frequency, a frequency of 24 hours per cycle. When we're measuring frequencies, usually we're using cycles per second or hertz. And if you convert a 24 hours per cycle, you get 11.6 microhertz. Incredibly slow cycle. Colour could be considered as an indication of a frequency of a line, because colours of light have different frequencies and wavelengths. And other dowsers have often given a doused frequency, various frequencies ranging from a few hertz up to megahertz. And there are dowsers within the Dowsing Research Group of the BSD who've developed equipment which has enabled them to measure the frequency that can be experienced when they're standing on energy lines. Colour, as I said, that could be seen as a frequency measure, but many dowsers have found that there seems to be a colour associated with the lines that they're finding, and you can use a colour disc, a chart, or a major disc, along with a pendulum, to get an indication of what the characteristic colour of the line is. In the Spirit of Albion, Gary Biltcliffe and Caroline Hoare doused Belinus as being a yellow colour and Ellen as violet. How old's an energy line? Well, dowsers have found that lines are associated with archaeological features. So there's the possibility that lines can exist for years, or have existed for years. You can use question and answer type dowsing or a dowsing chart to determine the age of an energy line, and you can also use it for determining the age of an archaeological feature, and you may be able to find out which came first, the energy lines or the standing stones. strength of lines. Some people are able to feel that lines are varying in strength. Some lines are stronger than others. If you're not that sensitive to them, then you can use a dowsing rod. Some people find that the speed of movement of a dowsing rod is an indication. Or you can ask, using a scale of 1 to 10, what the strength is, or use the Bovis scale. Bovis scale is often used as an indication of strength, or it's a strange scale to use because originally it was based on the wavelength of light as measured in angstrom units, but it's a scale that can be used. And it's been found that energy lines are often weakened by damage to the land, such as quarrying or pollution, and also by human action. I had the idea of dowsing to see what effect fracking would have when they started fracking in the Blackpool area. Unfortunately, before I got round to trying it, they'd stopped work on the site there. I wonder whether anybody else has tried to douse for the effects of fracking. I'm sure it doesn't do any good to the land. And the final one of the properties is that lines respond to interaction with people who are dowsing, making music, praying, by growing wider and stronger. It's as if they seem to appreciate our attention. I've read about experiments being done to send and receive simple messages along energy lines using dowsing. That's perhaps an indication of some sort of consciousness. And love and healing prayers can be sent along lines. That's an activity that Gary and Caroline use regularly to send love and healing to lines, especially making use of nodes. From my experience, the level of consciousness seems to be very similar to the consciousness and responsiveness of plants. And I've heard from dowsers like Maeve that some lines will move to places where they can be helpful if they're asked to do that, or if they see a need. I don't believe that it's our job to try and move lines, but I've found from experience that if you talk to a line and explain a situation in its locality, they may well move to a place where it's more appropriate for them to be. I wouldn't go as far as trying to move a line, but I've certainly had lines that have moved in relation to circumstances. Right, let's have a think about these two difficult questions. First of all, what are earth energy lines? Well, once again, Rory Duff came up with a description, and he's said he sees energy lines as linear concentrations of energy within an energy field. And I think it's not bad, but there's three terms in this phrase, earth energy lines. earth energy and lines. I think Earth's fair enough, because the lines are sometimes in or on the ground, sometimes just above the ground. And they do seem to be pretty well tied to particular locations on the Earth. If they were just in space, we'd never get to douse them, because they keep on disappearing as the Earth rotated. But so I think Earth is a reasonable term to have in our description. I'm not so sure about energy. What sort of energy is it? Why can't we more easily measure it? Is it actually energy, or is it information, or is it consciousness, or is it something else, or is it a mixture of all sorts of other things? So I'm a bit dubious about the word energy. And lines, well, it's even the narrowest of them have a width. Most are three-dimensional, and the widest can be very wide. So they're not really lines. So Earth energy lines isn't a very good description. Over the years within this meeting, we tried to find better names, and I think Maeve and Dave Charman worked hardest on this, and I think the total list comes to something like 60 possible names, descriptions of what we douse. A lot of them tending to be more along the lines of tubes or pipelines. But it's a real problem. Even Billy Gawn wasn't happy with the term earth energy lines, but he couldn't think of anything better, so he stuck with it. 35 years ago, it was something that was taxing the mind of the dowser Tom Wright. And he said, everything is energy. So what are energy dowsers picking up? The answer is simple, he said. Perceived patterns of perceived energy, interpretations of what we perceive and identify as coincidences in a network of energies, none of which are truly understood. And that is all. Anything else is a fiction of fools, another entry in the muddled mystical menagerie of the meta level. Well, if somebody as well regarded as Tom Wright can say that, I think it's something we all need to think about. And I wonder whether the situation's changed much in the last 35 years. There's all sorts of possibilities for what we're finding when we're dowsing for lines. When I first started, I'd read a bit about earth energy lines. So everything I found as I was plodding across the moors looking for lines was an energy line, an earth energy line. And they were useful because as I was following these lines, I kept on bumping into prehistoric cairns and standing stones. Might have only been big enough to trip me up, but they were there, well embedded in the earth. But more recently, I thought should be more open to other possibilities of what these lines may be. So I've been using a dowsing chart like this one, which gives me a set of options, including another, just in case I've missed something. And I found it quite useful. I don't find as many earth energy lines as I used to. In fact, a lot of what I dowse, if I dowse on this chart, it comes up as consciousness flow. But I think that what we dowse could actually fall into several of the categories here. So you might get some ambiguity. But I certainly recommend having a go with a chart like that. And I've uh, I've made a page of 4 dowsing charts that I found useful. A colour one, this one on what the lines might be, a date one, and a Bovis chart. And I've sent that to Alex. So when she sends out the link to the recording of the meeting, hopefully she'll include with it the page of charts, so you can give them a try if you fancy. Let's move on to the purpose of lines. From my experience, in some ways they're like lays. They do appear to connect sacred sites. And they can be useful to us by leading us to sacred sites that we're not aware of. They'll help us to find them, recognise them. And they do seem to want to help us to understand and appreciate our environment. Present-day geomancers use lays and energy lines to site buildings and other things that they're designing in the most appropriate location. Some of these geomancers are architects, and there's a couple who are members of this group. Recently, I've been reading a book by David Ellis and Melanie Thomas, who did geomantic work in the northwest of England, including work on the restoration of Gawn Monastery in Manchester. And what they've recorded in a book called On the Same Lines is quite fascinating. I don't think it's well known to many dowsers. Another source of information that might help us to understand energy lines is to see what we can find from the spirit world. I'm aware of 2 mediums who've asked the spirits that they're in contact with about energy lines. Anne Pogson is one of Maeve's friends from the Midlands. She's a dowser, but she's also a medium. And she asked the spirit that she works with what these energy lines are. And the answer she got was that ley lines energize and energy lines inform. And the sort of informing that they do, the spirit said, they tell you of the landscape and what lies beneath and everything around. She was a bit puzzled. She thought perhaps the spirit had got these the wrong way around. She thought energy lines ought to energize. But when she queried this, she was told that it was the dowsers that had christened these lines with these names. We haven't actually got it right. So ley lines energize and energy lines inform. The other medium is Michael G. Recchia. He's famous for channeling the Joseph Communications books, and he's worked in conjunction with Tony Clarkson from the Sanctuary of Healing at Langho in Lancashire. And through the website from the Sanctuary, they invited people who've been reading the Joseph's books, people involved with the Sanctuary, to send in questions on spiritual questions that they're trying to find more about. And I looked at some of the answers on the website, and I was quite impressed with the answers that come up to the questions that people had asked. So I thought, I'll give this a try. I sent in my question, which was, what is the true purpose of energy lines and how can we best work with them? And I got quite a detailed answer back through Michael, and he said it was Joseph of the Joseph Communications books that had provided the answer for him. And the answer said he wasn't distinguishing between energy lines and ley lines. They seemed to consider them to be much the same. But he said energy lines are more connected with deva activity than human activity. That groups of devas are located along the ley lines at specific points, and devas use the lines to connect with the planet, with animal lives, and with each other's. And my understanding, partly from the Joseph books and from other books I've read about devas and elementals, is that devas are a part of the angelic realm with a particular responsibility for the earth, for the animals and the plant life on the earth, rather than humans. They leave it to the angels to look after the humans. So essentially, energy lines are for the use of devas and must be treated with respect. The answer said that humans in general should keep away from the lines unless specifically called to work with them. And before working with a line, we should check our motives and obtain all necessary permissions. So devas play a vital role in the life of our Earth, but they go unnoticed most of the time. So perhaps Earth energy lines can help make us more aware of the devas so we can listen to them and work with them to ensure the survival of the Earth. Bon me. So that's where my exploration of Earth energy lines have led me. I hope you've found that useful, and it will inspire you to find more about energy lines. As far as I'm concerned, it's not the end. I've got a long way to go yet. And I look forward to hearing other people's views on my journey and on their journeys. I've included a list of the books and websites related to the people I've talked about. I think I've covered most of them. That's a final slide that I put up for when I did this talk for Westmoreland Dowsers. See if we can get a few more to join us here. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was a wonderful journey through a very long history as well, even though it's relatively recent in the ancient art and science of dowsing, it's also a very rich picture that you've painted, and lots of fascinating aspects and topics that you covered. So over to our lovely attendees. Any questions? I can see Jeff. If you want to ask Chris a question, would you like to unmute and ask?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Nice little summary there. I always worried about the use of the word energy, just like you did there. And what I realised in the end was it's a metaphor. It doesn't mean energy, but it means energy like. And what happened to electricity was that voltage is in fact electrical pressure. And before they called it voltage after Voltaire, they called it pressure. But they were trying to make it look like water. So electrical voltage is the same as water pressure in pounds per square inch or something of that nature. And in the end, they said, right, this is daft. We get confused here. We'll call it voltage. So what we need at the moment is another name for, shall we say, our dowsing energy. It's, as I say, it's metaphorically, it's like energy. It flows like energy. It seems to be closest to energy, but of course, no, it isn't. Yeah. So, what do you think of that?
Yeah, perhaps we should review the list that Maeve and Dave put together. Might well find some more. Yeah, yeah, I agree. It is. I'm not quite sure what a metaphor is, though. So
it's just a likeness.
Yeah, yes, I realise that, but
Yeah.
it's whether it help. Yeah, I think it's helpful.
Yeah. Similes and metaphors, they're basically you're trying to explain something by saying, well, it's like something else, you know.
Yeah.
But of course it isn't, but shall we say it's pretty close.
Yeah, metaphorical energy.
Yeah. The trouble is, of course, dowsing is not a mainstream event like electricity. Electricity proved to be extremely useful very, very fast, and therefore needed to be sorted. But for scientific interest, dowsing, we just plod along in the background. It's going to take probably hundreds of years before we get that sorted.
Yeah,
got to start somewhere.
Yeah, dowsing has proved to be useful as a technology, particularly for finding water and minerals. It's been recognised as a technology, even though we've no understanding of how we do it.
Imagine that dowsing becomes as mainstream as electricity.
Yeah.
What happens then?
We'll have to have a bigger meeting. Yeah. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, Jeff. And yeah, what an interesting perspective, and can take us in all sorts of directions. Maeve, are you ready to ask your question, Chris?
Yeah. Oh, I just wanted to thank Chris very much for the talk. I thought it was really, really interesting. I'd just like to clarify with the spirals and tubes within tubes of energy lines. Actually, I've refined it a bit since I did the diagram that Chris showed. And now what I'm finding is sort of the inner part of an energy line seems to be a core line with spirals around it. But then outside of that, you seem to then find the tubes within tubes. And the other thing that I'd like to say, you mentioned that we'd been asking about energy lines through Anne Pogson's mediumship. Well, we've started to take that a bit further now. And she's actually been in contact with a Victorian astronomer who apparently used to be paid by the aristocracy to move energy lines. That's only something that's come up recently. And he actually did say that there are severe consequences for doing that. And he wishes he'd never, ever done it because it had bad consequences on his life. But yeah, it's getting quite interesting. And this guy turned out to be called Norman Robert Pogson, and his descendants turned out to be some of the first members of the British Society of Dowsers. So I don't know where we're going with that at the moment, but watch this space.
Well, that looks like there's another story that's for presentation at
Yeah.
this meeting in the future. I'll look forward to it. Yeah, thanks, Maeve.
Thank you, Maeve. And Mark, if you're able
Lovely.
to.
Thank you, Chris. Wonderful talk. I've got half a list of books here I've got to look through. Shadow bands. Have you come across shadow band? Are there, little bands either side of the energy lines? And have you had
Yes.
any experience of this, please?
Yeah, I was introduced to bands outside of the main energy line by Nigel Twyn. It was at a BSD conference at Keele University, and we were dowsing the Belinus line in the university grounds, and we just doused the width of Belinus, and Nigel just chucked in this comment: "Have you tried dowsing a bit further out? There's some more out there. Go and see what you can find." And lo and behold, he was right, as usual. Yeah, and I've found bands outside of what would normally be found as the outside edge of a line quite regularly on lines. And I can remember exploring some lines in Derbyshire with Paul Thornton and Maeve, finding some very weird effects. Paul was finding what was almost like he described it as walking through waves on the outer part of the line, which we'd never encountered before. So yeah, there's a lot more to these lines than well, even than I suppose I could have done another talk just on the structure of energy lines and outer bands and things, but got to stop somewhere.
Lovely. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
And to connect in with that, it was interesting just the other day dowsing in the Mary line. It was obviously very wide, but there were some spirals at the edge, and we were talking about how they could be a bit like eddies, like you get in a stream of water where you get little eddies that sort of spiral against near the bank, or with different directions of streams. And so I'm wondering, with Mark's question about those other lines, maybe could it be another form of an echo, if you like, of how water goes in the concentric circles almost, doesn't it, and how it widens out. Just a thought. Ali.
Hi, that was a great talk, Chris. Thank you. Really informative for both beginners and experienced dowsers, might I add. That's so
that was the aim.
You covered, you had a hard brief, but you met it. So yeah, thank you. About messages being sent along lines, I've never thought about sending a human thought along the line. But Maeve, do you remember when I was at Stanton Drew and you were in Somerset and you were in Derbyshire at Matlock Bath, and I dropped a couple of drops of the Blackflower Remedy Star of Bethlehem onto the line, and you felt it? or said you did anyway.
Yeah.
And that was not far off instantaneous. So it's very curious, isn't it? Sorry, I just wanted to add more mystery to the whole situation.
Yeah. I think I first came across the idea of sending messages along lines, or that bad things could be sent along lines, from Hamish Miller's book. I think it was It's Never Too Late. I think in there he describes some experiments and also work he did to block malevolent use of energy lines. There's a lot in that little book.
Yes, that would be a good thing to know, how to stop malevolent use of them. But they probably have their own ways of getting you if you do what you shouldn't do. Yeah.
I think it's interesting, Chris, when you said earlier about sort of when there was a Joseph channeler, and also some of your own observations working with lines, if you kind of have the invitation, but also being careful for where we explore, where we tread, and how we interact with these lines. If we get some kind of clear call or message that is felt in the heart space, perhaps, rather than the head thinking, oh, I must fix this, it's useful to have that discernment in place, like you're hinting at, Ali, as well.
Yeah, I think we've got to consider lines as either being conscious beings or being very closely associated with other beings that have a lot more knowledge and understanding than we will ever have. And that I think it's good for us to try to communicate with the lines or the associated devas, but not try and do it our own way.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ali. Thanks, Chris. Gillian.
Hello. Hi, I'm sorry my camera isn't working, I have to say. It's so annoying when you're doing a presentation and it's just a black screen. But Chris, I wanted to say thank you so much for a great talk. And it's nice to see you, Alex. And I only live down the road from you, actually.
Oh.
I can see Darwin Tower from my from my house.
Oh, right.
So we should hook up and go out on the land one afternoon.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to ask you. I mean, I went on a dowsing expedition with Gary Biltcliffe and Caroline Hoare when they went up to Carlisle, which was really interesting. And we dowsed the Ellen line there. And the Ellen line in Carlisle runs through all the banks and the Masonic Lodge. So we sang to the line and we said prayers to the line and we dowsed it, and it increased from 10 foot to over 20 foot, 25 foot or something wide. So just mentioning that, you mentioned about conscious beings and things like that. I feel that the lines sort of work with us, or we can work with them. Do you feel it's linked to sort of like a planetary, like spirit of place and planetary angels? Because everything's connected. So all these lines that are going around, like the Ellen line, for instance, and the places it goes to, and all of that. As a conscious being, I feel they're conscious beings. Do you feel they're conscious beings? Because they're reacting with us when we sing and say a prayer. They're expanding.
Yeah, I'm finding that consciousness is a difficult term to make sense of, but
Yeah.
it keeps on coming to me more and more as I investigate lines. Just going back to Ellen, it's not surprising that Ellen liked you singing to her, because
Yes.
I can remember going through Manchester with Gary and Caroline,
Yes.
and one of the places that Ellen goes is through the Opera House in Manchester. So she must be quite fond of music.
Yes. Well, I've also sang to the Ellen line in Manchester at St. Mary's Parsonage, which is a
Yeah.
tiny triangular little piece of park before the Opera House.
Yeah.
Gosh,
Yeah.
that's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. We had an interesting journey through Manchester, starting at the Roman Castlefield
Yes.
fort, and going right through the parallel to Deansgate and ending up at the cathedral and Chetham School.
Yes.
Fascinating journey.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thanks for your question.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Gillian. Rob?
Hi, Chris. That was a great talk around energy lines. I'm an electrical engineer by trade and use cable locators for locating stuff underground when it's live. And there's an interesting similarity. When you're detecting an electric cable, you get echoes from that cable, either side of the cable, like the shadow lines you were talking about. So the same with water lines, you get echoes of water lines spaced away from water lines. So in the electronic world, there's a direct similarity between the effect you get from cables underground, cables over the ground, with energy lines. So there's a parity there with what is accepted in the scientific world and what is only accepted in dowsing circles.
Yeah. I've wondered occasionally that another parallel between electrical cables and energy lines, the electricity flows in the cable, but there's also an electric field around the cable, and our energy line's a bit like that there's a central core with a field outside of it, which we can detect by dowsing.
Well, just to correct you, Chris, if you look at the detail of how electricity flows in wires, the power actually goes around the outside of the circumference of the wire and not through the middle.
Yeah, I've never been able to understand electricity. I'm a chemist. Yeah. Yes, I've heard that, but it didn't make any sense to me.
Thanks again.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rob. Yeah, and Chris, just a bit of a story really to share. When you mentioned in an earlier slide about detrimental energies that can be felt on an earth energy line, just last Sunday I was teaching Sunday before last, I think, teaching a dowsing workshop, and by the end of the workshop there were a couple of people sitting next to each other who had developed a headache of similar stripes, if you like, and were finding it really hard to concentrate. And I remembered that a few weeks earlier, when I was preparing for the workshop, I doused the energy lines in this village hall, and there was a corner of the village hall that felt, that sort of leaden, heavy feeling that you can sometimes feel with an energy line if it's got either what's called a black energy line or something that's a bit bleh. And this line went diagonally through the hall and out into the field. And I realized that with dowsing, the line was upset, and it was going towards the churchyard where they were doing some renovations, and a builder's portaloo was sat directly on top of their line. So, people were pooping on this line, and it was not happy about it. And it was really interesting that it was going underneath where these two people were sitting. And we found another line in the hall that's a very beneficial line. And there was a spiral on it that was quite energizing and balancing. And just we got the supported answer to yes, stand on this line where the energizing spiral is to help clear the headache, clear and reset and realign all the energies. And after that workshop finished, I went with a dowsing friend to ask the energy line what it needed, what kind of support, if any, would it appreciate, and some dowsing sort of interactions and support and love were done to help protect with some mirrors from the toilet on top of it. And so just as an example, you can sit on an energy line and develop a headache. You can sit on an energy line and feel, or stand on it and feel great. So it's really amazing to have dowsing tools to help us identify where they're flowing, what's going on, and just being curious with it. Thank you so much, Paul, and love your description of how experiential sort of, on the ground dowsing is invaluable, and also your context for more about Chris's work and experiences, and how wonderful and how humble you are, Chris. So thank you very much. And also your mention of the frequency of the line, and if we're singing to it or drumming to it. And just to concur with your findings, we were on a Goddess Day last year at the Hurlers Stone Circle in Cornwall, and singing and dancing in a circle inside the main Hurlers Stone Circle, and we saw the line expand exactly like you were describing, very, very much. So thank you for that. Melanie?
Yes, sorry, I'm just reading out someone's comments. The lovely Anne saying, yes, I can confirm Chris has remotely doused a house I was going to view. And sure enough, I found the detrimental energy just where he said it was. Totally amazing. There you go, Chris.
Yeah, I think the key thing that's come through my experience is how vital it is to douse with other people. It surprised me when I put together that talk how many times I referred to Rory Duff, and considering I've never actually met him, he certainly had a big effect on my approach to dowsing. And I always remember one thing that he emphasized in his emails to me was get somebody to check what you're doing. Always be working with somebody else. And it was that was at the heart of what led us to start this Earth Energy Zoom meeting. Three of us really felt that we weren't going to get anywhere unless we were working together. And what we got out of it was vastly more than we expected. So
That's fascinating because, yeah, when you're crossing consciousness and it builds into more than the sum of its parts, doesn't it? When there's more of you. Local dowsing groups can be a great way of exploring that. Also, you mentioned Rory Duff, Chris, because I think, didn't he create the Sacred Network? And that was a way for people to sort of meet virtually. And there's also the British Society of Dowsers as well, with conferences and so on. Chris, is there anything else you would like to say before we ask Ali to potentially close, if that's okay, Ali?
I'd just like to thank all of you for participating in this session. As I said, working together is the key thing for good dowsing. So let's do it together. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Wonderful, grounded, experiential and expansive talk, Chris. It was super valuable because it's so clear the way you communicated everything, and so rich with all the information. Thank you again. And Ali, over to you when you're ready. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Alex. Kindly luminous beings, guardians of this Zoom space, we leave in love and peace, and thank you for your hospitality, blessings, and all your protections whilst we were in this Zoom space. And so let it be.